Hello, and welcome back to the Biostasis Technologies podcast. Today we have, well, we always have special guests, but we have an extra special guest this time. Perhaps the world's leading cryobiologist, Dr. Gregory Fahy, is Vice President and Chief Scientific Officer of 21st Century Medicine. He basically is the inventor of vitrification. I think that's not too much of an exaggeration to say. He co-founded Intervene Immune, a company developing clinical methods to reverse immune system aging. He was also, from 2022 to 2023, president of the Society for Cryobiology. He's also, I consider, a good friend, and I've known Greg for, I'm not sure how many years or decades, but a long time. Welcome, Greg.
A long time. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for having me, Max.
No. Well, mostly the focus of this will be this recent paper you published with a number of co-authors, which had some long-awaited results, very long-awaited for like a decade or so.
Yeah,
So
too long awaited.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and I presume there's more possibly to come from that work.
Yes, I think there may be. Not so much from the human side, but more from the rabbit side. There's some additional data I'd like to include, including a little bit of control data, because some of the things we saw that look like artifacts actually are not artifacts because you see them in controls, but I didn't have the controls in there. So little things like that we'd like to put in. But the big news about the status of the paper is that we may be able to submit it to the Journal of Cryobiology,
Oh,
which would be a huge thing if we can get it there
that's
because
the major journal,
things
right?
have changed recently. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, cryobiology is the journal of record in cryobiology, you might say.
Yeah.
And so we were planning to send it to PLOS One because of political reasons. Alcor had an abstract rejected because its name was on the abstract and not because of the contents of the abstract, but that's been remedied. And Alcor is going to be presenting a couple of papers at the cryobiology meeting in Seattle this year. So that being the case, maybe a paper that has my name on it and Alcor's name on it could actually get through the gauntlet at cryobiology, in which case that would be the place to take it.
All right.
So we will see. We will
Okay.
see.
Actually, for a quick bit of background, for those who don't know, for quite a few years, the Society for Cryobiology had a clause in the Constitution essentially threatening to excommunicate anybody and ruin their professional career if they were involved in cryonics in any way.
Yes.
However, just a few years ago, I think with some change in the leadership, that was removed from the Constitution. So it's no
Well,
longer a hanging offense, apparently.
it wasn't removed. It's still there, but it was
Oh,
watered down. It was made more mellow. But it's still there. But I think that that's not necessarily going to stay that way because a lot of things have happened recently that undermine the basic premise of that clause in the bylaws. So I think if you pardon the expression, I think the attitude of cryobiologists with respect to cryonics is about to thaw. I think they're warming up to us now. So
good.
that's really great news. There was a meeting on August the 21st of this year, 2026, at the ATP Bio convention. And ATP Bio is kind of the tail that wags the dog of cryobiology in some sense. It's not the same as the Society for Cryobiology, but many prominent members of the society are in and run ATP Bio. ATP Bio is a grant-based conglomeration of interest related to all facets, really, of cryobiology as it applies to everything from food to insects to whole organs. And I think that they really opened their minds this last month by considering whole body cryopreservation and what they should make of it. And so there are a number of people that came and gave a talk about that, and they were warmly received. So I think everybody feels really good about this. So it's the dawn of a new era, I think. And so maybe we can have more scientific viability, visibility, and more communication in both directions, which would be great all the way around.
Great.
So, yeah.
Yeah, let's just introduce the sort of the main, the paper covers both human brains and rabbit brains, but the main area of interest here was a cryopreservation we did back in, was it 2016 or 15, something around there?
Some such thing, yes.
Yeah, about
I
10,
don't
10
know.
years
I don't
ago.
remember exactly now.
And it's
Yes.
involved Dr. Stephen Cole, who we've both known for quite a few years. He's been involved in the life extension community. And initially, he didn't seem to want to be cryopreserved, didn't think it was working for whatever reason. But then he changed his mind. And we managed to arrange a case basically getting his permission to do some unusual research activities, including actually removing the brain from the skull, which we hadn't done, so at least in my time at Alcor, and able to take some biopsy samples that are used in the study. So it was been eagerly looking forward to the results because it sounded quite promising. You gave a couple of talks on this before, Greg, last year, where you gave some initial
Yes.
results that sounded pretty exciting. So tell us a bit about the goals of this research and the main findings before we dig into some specifics.
Yeah, there were many goals, but it was driven in or enabled by one particular goal that was uh, all motivated by Steve Coles himself. So the reason that Steve was very skeptical about cryonics is that he had heard about fracturing, and he considered that if the brain fractured, that would be the equivalent of cremation. Now, I don't agree with that, but that was his viewpoint. And so I put it to him. I said, Steve, maybe you can be the one to find out if we can overcome this. Because Alcor has a device that could store at minus 140. We think we can maybe get you down there without cracking your brain. So you want to give it a shot? You can answer this question yourself. And he said, yes. So it turned out that we had a bigger margin for error than we thought because as you say, Dr. Cole's brain was removed. It had to be removed so it could be inspected for cracks. And I would never, want to see a brain removed like that, but we had to for this research project. And as it happened, the brain went down to minus 146 and then came back up again to minus 140. But when it was photographed, there were no visible cracks. So that was a really big hallelujah moment. But whether that would still happen if the brain had not been removed, nobody knows. So that would be maybe a question for another day.
A quick follow-up on the fracturing point. I think I've heard you tell me this before, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Is it the case that brains actually are less prone to fracturing in your experience than other organs? Better kidneys
It's
and
hard.
lungs? So
It's hard to answer that question. It kind of depends on the context. Um, I'm trying to remember the exact details, but we did some experiments vitrifying whole pigs, and we looked for fracturing, and we saw no fractures at minus 130, and we saw some fractures at minus 136, I think, but none in the brain. So I think it was the spleen maybe that fractured in that case. But it's a little bit of an unfair comparison because the spleen is enormous, and so it stores up energy across a much larger volume, much larger distance. Uh, but yeah, so eventually, as you get down to lower temperature, then you do start to see some brain cracks. Uh, but uh, but it was pretty good to know that in a skull and in a pig, the skull is very prominent compared to the brain in humans. There's the ratio of skull to brain is much higher in a pig. But in any case, we were able to show that you can get down to at least minus 130 without any brain fractures, and I think a bit below that. And that's without removing it from the skull. So there's hope along those lines. Uh, I think there's also hope from some of Hugh Hickson's old crack phone data because he showed cracking events in some of circumstances near minus 140. But I can tell you from personal experience that those cracking sounds did not necessarily mean that a crack has actually occurred. Even in a brain inside the skull, according to Hugh Hickson's crack phone data, you can get very close to minus 140. And we think if you store at minus 140, you can store as long as you want.
now you mentioned that Steve Coles was, concerned about fracturing. I haven't really been so concerned myself because it seems to me that the kind of, and again, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the level of damage that you were talking about there is not really damage on the ultrastructural scale. So the repairs we're likely to make anyway will probably be able to handle cracking. Is that a fair viewpoint, do you
That
think?
that that's a reasonable point of view, but it does neglect a couple of practical issues, such as if you have cracking, two things may move with respect to each other. So now you have not only the standard repair problem, but also registry issues. You're going to have to somehow bring these physical objects back into registry with each other and sew them back together again. And glass prefers to fracture than, to be moved around. So it becomes a little bit more complicated. And another problem with it is that you can expect molecular nanotechnology to be developed for normal medical purposes. Like if you have aging and your mitochondria are no good, you go in there perhaps and repair them, molecule by molecule. And so a lot of the repair technology for cryonics would naturally flow out of medicine, just mainstream medicine. But there's no aspect of mainstream medicine which your brain would normally crack. So that would have to be developed separately from what most people might be interested in. And so that might be a higher barrier to accomplishment. So obviously, the less damage, the better. The less esoteric the damage, the better. So, I think Steve's concern was overblown, but it's not trivial. It's not negligible. Definitely, crack avoidance is something that should be done if possible.
Yeah. The only problem with that seems to be, at least so far, avoiding the cracks means doing intermediate temperature storage, as you say, like minus 150,
Yes,
minus 140. And the
that's
problem
right.
with that is it generally seems to be a lot more expensive, maybe 3 times as much. Maybe there's some new designs that bring that down. Also, you have to have an active, obviously, electrical system and a backup to make sure you don't warm up. Or actually, it wouldn't warm up. It will cool down, right, given the design.
Yes.
So that's kind of the downside of that.
That's true, but the downside is that if you do cool down and fracture, you're no worse off than you would have been otherwise.
Right.
But meanwhile, you have a chance to escape that problem.
So it's
And
good
and
to have all
also
these.
batteries can last a long time. So if there's a temporary power failure and you've got a really good battery, you may be able to tough it out until nitrogen becomes an even deeper problem.
All right.
Yes.
So again, before we get to some of the specifics, do you want to sort of give us the bottom line results? What this study
I can do
showed?
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it showed a few things. So it's also put in context in this paper. So with respect to the direct results, the key question was if you are going to be cryopreserved by any cryonics organization, but in this case by Alcor in particular, um, can your brain even be perfused? We have in a laboratory situation, well-controlled conditions, we take the brain, perfuse it with cryoprotectant. There's no warm ischemic damage, there's no cold ischemic damage, but in a real situation, you have both warm and cold ischemic damage, and certainly Dr. Coles had to undergo that. Dr. Coles also had to undergo 2 or 3 days of agonal hypotension and other issues during the dying process itself. And there's been no study, no knowledge of what that might do to the fate of the brain when you now go to perfuse it. Although, of course, anecdotally, Alcor has tons of experience with perfusing brains under all kinds of conditions. And as a general rule of thumb, it seems, from what I understand, that you can perfuse a brain uh, even up to about 24 hours after the heart stops. And in Dr. Cole's case, being an MD, he understood the importance of getting preserved under good conditions. So there was only about a 3 hour gap between the time that he was pronounced and the time he
Mhm.
was able to start getting perfused. But still, nobody really knew what was going to happen. Okay, so you can perfuse with cryoprotectant, maybe, but are you perfusing the whole brain? Are you perfusing only half of it? Are you uh, perfusing it, but perfusing half of it down the drain. There's was just nothing known, right? It was a black box. And I'd actually been asked to write a review about cryonics for a cryobiology journal by the editor of the journal. That editor, by the way, having in the past been an arch anti-cryonicist, uh, who said, as you get older, you start asking yourself, well, why not? So I said, okay, I'll do the review. And then I realized I don't know anything. There's no data, not on humans. We don't know what happens after this agonal period and the cryotransport and all of that stuff. So I decided I just couldn't write anything because there's nothing known. There was no um, inspection of the human brain after cryopreservation. And so the
Other than
Dr.
CT
Cole's
scans, which
dilemma.
doesn't tell you the level of detail you need. Yeah.
That's right. It tells you, yeah, uh, and at the time we did these experiments back in 2015 or something, there are probably a lot less CT data than there are now too. But in any case, um, there's no ultrastructural data. So we had some ultrastructural data on rabbits, but that's under pristine conditions, and those are rabbits, not humans, et cetera, et cetera. So in the real world, what happens, and nobody knew. So Dr. Coles realized that he had no other alternative, but he also realized he had no money. And Alcor had money for research, but it didn't have a human brain to do research on in the way that would shed more light on some of these issues. So we made a deal, and he agreed that his brain would be removed, which like I said before, I would never recommend under normal conditions, and biopsied, and the biopsies would be looked at. And he had a couple of conditions. One is that he wanted his name on the paper, and the other is that he wanted Dr. Steve Harris's name to be on the paper because he was good buddies with Steve Harris, and Steve Harris helped to arrange for the procedure. So he did have a legitimate role in the unfolding of the research. In any case, so the objectives were to address Dr. Cole's issue about cracking and to address the broader issue of ultrastructural preservation. So I think we all agree that if you want to preserve a brain, you better, at least as a minimum condition, preserve the structure. Because if there's no structure, there's going to be no function. If you preserve the structure, then you have at least satisfied the minimum requirement for repair or even for, demonstrating viability. So it was a great opportunity, but it introduced a lot of departures from normal procedure. Alcor was not prepared for this.
You and I were on the phone at the last minute, figuring out the
Yeah,
protocols and revising them.
exactly. People didn't know what to do, and I had no time, so I couldn't communicate as well as I wanted to. And on top of all of that, Alcor's normal surgeon was not available, and you were breaking in a new surgeon who had no experience whatsoever in this particular procedure. So we had a lot of things stacked against us, but the team at Alcor was terrific. And yeah, there was a bit of complaining here and there, but very justifiably so. But they knuckled under and they did what needed to be done, and we got the experiment done. And the results now are, what we were looking for all the time, except the only thing is that they came out much better than I expected, or much better than we dared hope. They could have been anything. We had no knowledge, right? But and there's certainly some injury, but nothing that's that significant in my opinion. All of the essential structures are preserved. The synapses are there, myelin sheaths are there, axons, dendrite cell bodies, everything is there. Now, to be sure, Dr. Cole's brain, like everybody else's brain, shrank a lot. And so if you look at the cerebral cortex, which is what we had access to, you see the structure is there. It's all very dense. Everything's condensed. So it's hard to make out a lot of, fine detail, but you can see that, everything that gives the brain color in a histological section, all the proteins and intracellular material, it's all compressed into a smaller volume. But all those colored agents are still there. So the brain is very dark in color, as you would expect if none of the molecules leaked out of it. So it seems like the molecular inventory of the brain is there. The cellular contents are there. That's a very general statement, but it's a pretty good one to be able to make.
The cells didn't all explode like Michio Kaku likes to say.
Exactly. That's all nonsense. Maybe in the old days you'd have some justification for making such a gross error, but not anymore. Not when we're vitrifying the system. Now, if the vitrification had not been complete, you wouldn't be able to say that. But I will tell you, I have been able to look at field after field after field of Dr. Cole's histological section, which covers a lot of territory, and it all looks identical everywhere. It all looks intact. There are little areas near blood vessels that give you some ambiguous looking areas, but my understanding of what that's due to is just a sectioning issue. If you have a thin layer of brain tissue overlying a blood vessel and you cut it in just the right way, things may look disconnected, but they're really not. So there's nothing there that bothers me really at all. As a matter of fact, I would tell you that I was satisfied with rabbit brains back in 2002 or so. And this particular human brain looked better than the rabbit brains, a little bit less distorted than the rabbit brain. So humans are tougher, than lower animals, than rabbits, and it shows up in this particular context, which is terrific news.
Well, our brains have to last a lot longer. I mean, if you look at humans live, was it 4 or 5 times as long as we're supposed to, according to some measure, like certain
Yes.
animals. Yeah, like mole rats live like 4 or 5 times as long as they're supposed to.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
humans
we're
seem to
on
have,
par with mole rats.
yeah, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
We're better looking though, I think.
I agree with that too. Uh, yeah, so it pays off in this context because our brains look better as well. So that was the central news. The terrific news is that it looks like the molecular detail that you would need for nano repairs, or even potentially for very high sophistication revival scenarios, might actually be there. But we went a little bit beyond that, and got other results that are very exciting too. So if you look at the cerebral cortex, you see the what we call ground substance, the colored part of the brain substance is there because it's all very condensed and everything. But of course, the brain is shrunken, and the cells within the brain are also shrunken too. So typically in the cerebral cortex, the neurons that you see look like pyramids. They're pyramidal in shape. But in Dr. Cole's brain, they were shrunken down to, they look more like marbles. That's just osmotic in nature. It didn't look like shrinking down to a marble tore anything, so that's good. But they were just not normally pyramidal shaped. And so the beautiful thing is, in the rabbit series that we did in parallel to Dr. Cole's, I wanted to look at the ultrastructure in more detail. And so the complaint of the neurobiologist has always been, well, I can't see anything. Nothing makes any sense to me. It's like when I was in graduate school and I was looking at frozen kidney, I couldn't figure out what I was looking at first because it looked so different. But once you understand it, then you say, oh, yeah, everything is there. It's just kind of ripped here, or distorted there. So the dehydrated brain looks like an alien territory to a neurobiologist, but to a cryobiologist, it's not that scary.
Mm.
But to make it friendlier to the neurobiologist, you want to do something to make it look more normal. So the answer to that is you begin to wash out the cryoprotective agent. And so the more cryoprotectant that you wash out of the rabbit brain, the more it looks like a rabbit brain and less like something from another planet. And so we were able to show that the synapses and the presynaptic vesicles and all that kind of stuff is still there in the rabbit brain. So why not do something similar to that with Dr. Cole's brain? With the rabbits, you can perfuse out the CPA, but you couldn't do that with biopsy samples from Dr. Cole's. But what you could do is break them up into small pieces, drop those pieces into diluted versions of M22, let them sit there for a little while to take up some water, and then fix them and have a look at them. So we did that. So if you dilute it to 3/4 strength M22, what you see is the cell structure is beginning to look more normal. And if you dilute to 2/3 of M22, the normal pyramidal shape comes back, and the projections of the cells look normal in every direction. It's really quite striking. So not only is the structure preserved in the dehydrated state, but membrane properties are preserved also. The membrane acts like a normal membrane. When water goes across it, the cell volume is able to change in response to that. If, for example, the cells had been fixed chemically, the cells wouldn't care what you did to the environment. They'd stay in the same shape. But these cells have the more properties. They have properties that are more similar to living cells. They actually can respond to changes in their environment. So that's very exciting also. So it's really a different kind of situation that we find ourselves in. We have now much deeper enlightenment about what happens. And I also think that what this means is that if you're interested in cryonics, you'd better take this seriously now. This is not just a parlor trick, which might or might not happen, or has a 1% chance of happening. So why do it well? You're not likely to make it. No, I don't think that's true at all. If you get preserved under good conditions, your brain, if it's like Dr. Cole's brain, will be excellently preserved. And if it's excellently preserved, that has a big implication for what your chances might be of revival. So I think we need to take this a lot more seriously than perhaps some have done in the past. If you think this is a real patient, this might actually work, you better do everything you can not to screw it up.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out, I think, that although there are certainly worse circumstances than Steve Cole's had. There are also better ones, people who've taken advantage with the death with dignity laws, who can actually have the team standing by, maybe skip that whole agonal period, which is probably quite undesirable.
Yes.
So actually get even better results from that potentially.
Yes, I agree with you. I know of one case that was done in Wisconsin that happened to coincide with the cryobiology meeting that was done in Wisconsin. And this was handled by Mike Darwin, and she was done under such good conditions. And maybe, it's off color to say this, but she was done under such good conditions. She began to wake up when they started washing her blood out. And so people put a lot of anesthetic into the profusate now to avoid that. But she probably, if the Coles experiment had been done on her and I got biopsies back from her, I probably could have shown that those cells are alive after to be determined at some future date. But you begin to realize that you can get much farther, with this procedure than you might initially think.
By the way, just for the viewers who don't know, not familiar, M22 is the vitrification solution that you invented and is now standard use, at least by Alcor and other organizations
Yes.
use something related to it, but not quite the same. Um,
Well, it's actually not related to it much at all, but and
oh,
I will have to give some credit to Brian Woke. I would say we were the co-inventors of it. We
right.
contributed different features to it.
Yeah. So one
Yes.
question, actually, this one I think was suggested by Brian to sort of help educate the audience a little bit. People may be wondering, well, the vitrification technology currently used doesn't open the blood-brain barrier, and yet your study showed absence of freezing damage. Can you explain what the blood-brain barrier is, how cryoprotectants prevent ice formation even when the barrier remains closed? It might be puzzling.
Yes. So one aspect of the answer is that even when the blood-brain barrier is not directly opened, it is still partially permeable to cryoprotective agents. So we actually measured the distribution of cryoprotectants into Dr. Cole's brain. We've also done the same kinds of measurements in rabbit brains and particularly in pig brains. And you will still get a decent amount of cryoprotectant to cross that blood-brain barrier. So one good thing about cryoprotectants is that they are low in molecular weight, so they're small in size, and so they're not completely excluded from the blood-brain barrier. They're it's a significant barrier for sure, but there's some CPA that goes across. And so the other process is that water comes out of the brain osmotically. So I sometimes make an analogy to a bottle of perfume. If you open a jar of perfume, you smell it on the other side of the room because there's a greater tendency for perfume molecules in the bottle to leave the bottle than there are for them to go back in. It's just probabilistically uh, more likely for something in a high concentration area to go to where it's not. And so the same is true of water. So if you have a lot of water in your brain and then you replace the vascular contents with something that has very little water in it, then water, of course, will by, statistical probability move into that vascular space, which means it's coming out of the brain, which means that if nothing is going in to replace it, the brain is going to get smaller. So subtraction of water means the brain is less freezable. That will concentrate proteins and other things inside the cell, which makes the cytoplasm less freezable. But since some CPA does cross the blood-brain barrier, some of that water is replaced. And so what ends up happening is that you can raise the concentration of a cryoprotective agent in the brain, say in a brain cell, two different ways. You can have it go all the way through and reach equilibrium so that you have the same concentrations of water and cryoprotectant everywhere in the same cell volume and everything like that. Or you can have a little bit of CPA go in and a bunch of water coming out that concentrates the cryoprotectant to the same concentration anyway. It just that it does so partly by this water subtraction, which means brain cell shrinkage, which could induce some injury, but it still allows vitrification to take place. So it doesn't you don't have to open the barrier perfectly. Partial barrier opening is good enough at least to vitrify the brain. And then as a higher level of technology, we would like to add a bit more finesse to it so that you can make the barrier leaky enough for the CPAs to get in faster, but not so leaky that you end up causing more problems.
And that'd be using something like SDS, which if I'm saying is right, sodium dodecyl sulfate, is that right? That's
Yes,
one of the
that's
things you
right.
would use for that. Do you think cryonics organizations should be using those kind of solutions now, or do we need more testing before we decide if there's a downside?
We do need more testing. And the reason that we need more testing is that uh, the use of those things can be hazardous if they're used in too high of a concentration, even in fresh brains. But in postmortem, quote unquote, postmortem brains, you may have an increased permeability of the blood-brain barrier by itself. And if you exaggerate that too much, you may create problems. So let's say that you're perfusing the brain and you have hydroxyethyl starch in there to prevent the brain from swelling. And now the barriers open so much that the hydroxyethyl starch goes into the brain, then the brain is going to swell. So you then have two problems. You have shrinkage and swelling kind of superimposed. We don't really want that. So you have to be careful about it. And so you might get into trouble in cryonics patients by applying this, but we don't really know. And it probably depends on circumstances. So
Mhm.
uh, the better the conditions under which you're preserved, the more likely it is that ice blockers are going to benefit you. The worse you're perfused, probably the least likely it is that you'll benefit. So the other thing about it is that in our laboratory, we're looking at alternatives to SDS. Uh, and we think we found a few that look more safe and more effective than SDS. But that's all I can tell you right now. It's early days, and
There's
it's
active
got to be.
research going into this. Okay.
Yeah, we're doing active research on this, and we're very aware of the issue for cryonics of whether these things should be used or not. That's one of the questions we hope to answer going forward, but we just don't have an answer right now.
All right. Okay. Very good. Do you expect that your positive structural preservation results will be followed by a demonstration of functional recovery in whole cryopreserved brains? And if so, how far away is that development?
That's an excellent question. That's really the big question. So I define cryonics as preservation under conditions that are not verified to be reversible. In other words, you don't know when you go into the process whether it's ever going to be reversible or not. But suspended animation is when you go in knowing that it can be reversed. So a lot of people would go for suspended animation, not so many for cryonics. If we can convert cryonics into suspended animation, then it's game over, right? That happens when the brain can be revived, when you can show that it functions and it's alive after you warm it up from cryogenic temperatures. So that is our goal at 21st Century Medicine. We've been pursuing that for a long, long time, and there's plenty of problems that have to be overcome to get there, but we're getting very close. So Dr. Spindler in our lab now has the luxury of working on this full time, which he's been doing for a couple years now, and he's made all kinds of innovations in diagnostic techniques and also in loading and unloading methods that seem to give much better results than previous methods. So we're getting closer, and I'll just let on a little secret that he did one experiment, and caution, it's only one experiment, but he actually vitrified a brain, warmed it up, washed all the CPA out of it, and then subjected the brain to viability testing, and at least based on the K to NA ratio, looked completely viable.
Hmm.
So there is a chance that we can do this, maybe not in a future that is as far away as we would have thought. But it's still a work in progress. So we're very excited, but we have a long way to go to make it reproducible and robust. And also, brain viability on the brain cell level, which is what he looked at, is different from physiological viability. So it's nice to know that the brain cells are alive, but the vascular system has to be functional as well. Otherwise, you can't get the benefit out of that. You have to be able to reperfuse the brain with blood in order to resuscitate it. And Dr. Spindler has found that when he reperfuses rabbit brains with blood after they've been loaded and unloaded with cryoprotectants or cryopreserved, that oftentimes the vascular system seems to be the limiting factor.
Hmm.
So we need to do some more work on that. But this is expected in scientific research. You don't solve it right out of the box. You have to learn many things as you go along. So we're in that process now, and we're pretty excited about it.
And this reminds me of
I'm not sure
something
if that answered your question
yeah, yeah. Well,
exactly, but
well,
indirectly it answered it.
can't really
Yes.
have an exact answer because we can't really predict the timeline.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah,
Predictions are a guess anyway. That's
yeah.
true.
But this reminds me of an idea that you had before, which I've heard that someone is pursuing. Maybe you know about this. Um, you noticed that someone had done a study where they'd, I guess I don't know if it was a brain, it was probably an organoid, and they trained it on a flight simulator and it
Oh,
seemed to
yes.
learn the task. And your idea was, well, why don't we do something like whether it's a game of Pong or a simple flight simulator, and then cryopreserve it, rewarm it, and see if we can get not just coherent electrical activity like Suda got from monkey brains apparently, but something more sophisticated. Is do you know if
Absolutely.
that is that research underway? Is that something that's going to happen?
It's not quite underway, but we have it under good authority that that's going to be funded very soon.
Yeah,
So we put this we wrote the proposal up, sent it into CryoDAO, and they said they love it and they want to fund it, and they were
right.
interested in funding it in mid April, but we need a piece of equipment, and we had some doubts as to whether we could get it. Those doubts are gone, so everything looks go. So hopefully we'll get funded within the next few months and be up and running. So to just add a little bit more flesh to your introduction to the idea, the thing that really caught my attention was that this guy named Damaris was able to project a video camera image to a bunch of brain cells in a dish and punish them if the plane looked like it was going to crash, and reward them if the plane looked like it was going to stay level. In other words, if the wings of the plane were tilted, then they would get negative reinforcement, and
Mm.
if it was horizontal, they got positive reinforcement. So basically, he taught a bunch of brain cells in a dish to fly an airplane, so to speak, and it was phenomenal. But I thought, well, crap, if you can do that, let's, train the brain cells to fly an airplane, cryopreserve them, warm them back up. If they can still do something that
That's impressive.
sophisticated,
Yeah.
that proves that you can preserve not only just some dumb memory, but a very sophisticated,
Mm.
complex memory as well. So we pitched that basic idea to CryoDAO, and they like it. So we're going to see if we can do it. And that particular experiment with flying an airplane may not be what we do. We may do Pong, or we may do
Right.
things like character recognition to start with. Can you tell the difference between the letter F and the letter G, or some such thing? But whatever it is, it's going to make the point. And then we have further ambitions to layer on top of that. So that's just brain cells in a dish, right? Those are brain cells that are not normally associated with learning and memory. So what if we could do the same thing on hippocampus, like a slice of hippocampus? Because we showed with Yuri Pichugin back in 2006 that we can vitrify hippocampal slices and rewarm them, and they're perfectly viable. They're perfectly well preserved structurally. And then, and work that's mostly still unpublished, we showed that everything that we can measure about them electrically and electrophysiologically is indistinguishable from control brain slices as well. So why not train these things? So if we can do that, then it takes it up a notch, because now we're saying brain structures that normally encode memory can encode these particular memories and can recover these particular memories. And the tertiary benefit of this is, if we can get it at the hippocampal level, we may be able to induce the same kind of learning in a living, intact brain, and then cryopreserve it, warm it back up, take the hippocampus out, and then see if we can get the same kind of response. If we can do that, that's tantamount to suspended animation of the brain, or very close to it.
Yeah, it makes it
So
very hard
we're
for people
we're
to
heading down.
dismiss it. Yeah, people can look at
Yeah,
these pictures of synapses and so on, and they can say, "Well, yeah, but does that really mean it's going to recover?" So this would be, I think, a very
yeah,
powerful demonstration. But
yes, exactly.
I'm not sure
It,
it'll
it
actually
will.
be the turning point because it seems that people have so many psychological blocks to doing this for various reasons. But hopefully, it will, turn the corner for some people at least.
That's true. So maybe it'll turn the corner for Elon Musk or somebody like that, who needs this kind of technology for other reasons as well, who may be able to accelerate this research and expand it. And once you do the brain, what's left? Well, the rest of the body would be nice to be able to do. That's going to take big bucks and a lot of money and time. So If we can do the brain, that qualifies us to go on to other things, to even more ambitious goals. Um, Nothing we can do right now, but something that, could maybe be done eventually.
Yeah.
Yes.
What new technologies or advances do you think are necessary to achieve functional recovery of whole cryopreserved brains, and how much do they overlap with advances necessary to perfect banking of transplantable organs?
Yeah, those are great questions. There's many similarities and many overlaps, and there are many dissimilarities, of course. So it turns out that each individual organ has its own cryobiological issues. So, for example, livers don't care much about cryoprotectant toxicity, but they care a lot about chilling injury. Kidneys kind of care about both chilling injury and cryoprotectant toxicity, but mostly cryoprotectant toxicity. In kidney, it seems that the data that we have so far indicates that chilling injury actually is just cryoprotectant toxicity continuing over the time that the organ is cooling and warming. So very different there. And then the heart, nobody knows in detail, but the heart muscle has limited permeability to cryoprotectants, and the limiting factor for heart may be uptake of the cryoprotectants. Now, to a certain extent, it may be possible to address all of these things by having better cryoprotectants. So we're working on that as well. So I had to invent a new cryoprotectant, I don't know, 10, 20, 15, 10, 15 years ago, because we had a big corporate partner that wanted to preserve a difficult tissue, but they didn't like one of our components of our cryoprotectant. And so they said, get rid of that. But I needed that. So I had to come up with a substitute for it. So that worked, but wasn't quite satisfactory. So we've gone on in the following years to develop a total of 4 novel cryoprotective agents that we haven't really disclosed publicly yet, of which there's one that's particularly promising. It seems to equilibrate very quickly in brain and in kidney. It's pretty non-toxic, and it's possible to compose vitrification solutions based on it that are competitive with M22, which is the first time we've been able to do something like that since we invented M22 circa 2002 or 2003. So that's very promising, but we're not the only ones pursuing that particular piece of the Holy Grail, because you have people like Adam Higgins out there doing high throughput screening of potential cryoprotective agents, and he's already discovered some interesting interactions and possibly some other examples of toxicity neutralization, which is another big factor in being able to preserve different kinds of organs, because if you can make the cryoprotectants intrinsically less toxic, they will be more generally applicable across different organs, including the brain. So with the brain, of course, you have the blood-brain barrier, but maybe we can overcome that. Um, the brain is relatively easy to vitrify compared to other organs, so it seems. So you don't have problems with the brain like you have with the kidney, in which you have part of the kidney that's very hard to perfuse. But you may have other issues that we haven't discovered yet. So maybe the vascular system is more delicate in the brain than the kidney. So there's a lot of unanswered questions. I guess the top level answer is that each organ is a separate research project. It's a separate, it poses a separate set of problems, which require a separate set of solutions.
Right.
And the art of getting to suspended animation someday will be to find out how to, cross bridge between all of these different requirements and come up with a universal solution. But I think it can be done. It's just going to take a lot more work. But we have a lot of brilliant people in this field now doing a lot of very smart work. So hopefully, we're moving toward that sooner than you might think.
Yes, it's kind of fortunate that it turns out to be the case, right? That the brain actually does relatively well. It could have been the other way around. So
Yes,
the universe is not
yes,
totally against us.
yes.
Yeah.
So at the ATP Bio meeting, I presented some data on whole animal vitrification, rabbit vitrification, and pig vitrification. And I pointed out in the case of the pig, that the data showed that the part of the pig that's the easiest part to vitrify is the brain. And somebody asked me a question about that. They found that quite intriguing. So, the cryobiologists are, increasingly aware of this. which again, it removes another barrier of credibility toward, what cryonicists are trying to accomplish. Because if the brain were really, really hard to vitrify, it would be a whole different story. But actually, it's pretty easy. So that simplifies the problem to, preventing shrinkage injury and preventing cryoprotectant toxicity. And we've got a lot of tools at our disposal for both of those.
Do you think that generative AI it would be useful in coming up with new combinations of chemicals and discovering new options, or is it not really at the point where it's helpful in this field?
It may. It may. We did a little test actually of our own, and it came up with the same CPA that I invented on my own. So uh,
Well, I may
maybe
just
give
have read your
myself some.
paper. May just have read your paper though, right? And gave it back to you.
No, this is one of the ones that nobody's heard of yet.
Oh,
So it invented it out of whole cloth. So
oh, okay. Well, that's interesting.
yeah. So but I invented it first, so it's still my invention. Uh, but that's the only example that I know of so far. So we will see. We will see. The typical issue is garbage in, garbage out. So you need to have the right kind of understanding of the data you put into it so that the AI system can process it intelligently enough to come back with the right answer. But I think that's increasingly possible. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if, in a relatively short amount of time, people have enough sophistication to put the right parameters in so it can make the right picks and the right choices. And the search field is probably smaller than some people think. Brian and I were just discussing this a couple days ago that for a molecule to be good as a cryoprotective agent, is particularly a main component of a solution, it has to be low molecular weight so it can get into cells. It has to vitrify well, and it has to not be toxic. And it's hard to have all of those things happen in one molecule. And so even if you combine molecules with each other, there's a limit on how bad any one of them can be and still be in the mix usefully. So I think that if you put all that together, the field of search is limited, but it's still a lot bigger than the number of CPAs that people have used so far. So there should be some winners out there to be discovered. So we'll see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a week or two ago, I was in Portland and went to visit Spark's Brain Preservation, which I was
Oh
kind of
yeah.
stunned by how much they've done there. He's poured, obviously millions into that facility. It's quite impressive. Um, so there's kind of a division in the biostasis community between people focused on cryopreservation and those looking at chemical preservation.
Yes.
So that leads to my question. Until fully reversible brain vitrification is developed, what advantages does classical vitrification offer for preservation of memory and personal identity in biostasis compared to chemical fixation approaches?
One moment. Pray Natasha will have to edit this so I can shut up this phone.
No problem.
Okay. Um, yeah. So the answer is that no one knows exactly for sure. So for why don't you phrase the question over again so that we can just kind of start with that fresh, and then we'll just take it so I can answer you in the language that you're using to
Yeah.
pose the question. All right.
So given current methods, what advantage does vitrification as it's done today offer for preservation of memory and personal identity compared to chemical fixation options?
Yes, and the answer is nobody really knows because we don't know what encodes memory and we don't know what encodes personal identity. And also with the fixation method, we don't know how that information is going to be used. So the people who are proponents of chemical fixation have their own ideas about what that's good for. My ideas about what that's good for would be entirely different. But as long as the chemical fixation preserves the molecular inventory in the brain, then in theory, you could use that to reconstitute the individual. However, we're not sure about that, but we do know that if you could cryopreserve the brain and have it viable, you could definitely reconstitute the individual. And so that's a more certain outcome. Uh, it's also less of a stretch technologically to get from where we are now to where we want to get. We don't have to impose this extra level of damage on top of everything else that nobody knows how to reverse right now. And that would require additional nanotechnology to reverse it, if it even can be reversed. Um, I think that the issue of readout of the information is kind of important for current discussions because people talk about taking the brain and sectioning it in a, and then looking at it in the electron microscope. And part of the problem with that is you're going to miss a lot of information, and you may miss information that's important. You'll never see every synapse that way. You're going to miss synapses, or you'll cut some of them at a grazing angle. Um, and there are, as I've described elsewhere in another interview I gave recently about this paper, there are membrane proteins that are important too, not just synapses, and you can't see those with conventional electron microscopy. Maybe you could decorate them, but then that gets into all kinds of other problems, and the practicality of that starts becoming unreasonable. So I think that for me, the problem is that we don't know if the fixation process will irreversibly destroy something important. So if we have evidence that the structure is preserved without fixation and that the osmotic responsiveness of the brain cells is preserved without fixation, we know all the molecular inventory seems to be preserved without fixation. It seems unnecessary to just destroy everything by fixing it, turning you into a block of plastic. So I don't favor that except under some conditions. So we did a series of experiments on pigs in which we tried to simulate what happens with some worst case or semi bad case cryonics scenarios. In a rabbit or in a pig, if you terminate perfusion, you induce cardiac arrest for an hour and then you perfuse with N22, you get pretty good results. If you don't induce warm ischemia, but you preserve the brain for 24 hours by hypothermic methods and then load in N22, you get pretty good results. But if you have an hour of warm ischemia and then you impose 24 hours on top of that, you tend to get pretty bad results. Mm-hmm. So in a scenario in which you're going to have significant warm ischemia combined with significant cold ischemia, it may be preferable to lock down the structure with fixation as early as you can in that process. If you know that you're going to have to endure 24 hours of cold storage after many hours of warm ischemia, and if you think you can perfuse fixative before you can transport the individual to where they need to go to be preserved, that might be the only way to preserve the structure in some cases. So under those circumstances, it's a lot better than what you would otherwise get. But that's a story.
And then you talk about a combination of cryopreservation and chemical preservation, aldehyde-stabilized cryopreservation, basically.
Yeah, and always I would say you want to load up cryoprotectants and then preserve it at low temperatures. There was an allegation in a recent paper that storing at -30 might be good enough. But there's no substantiation for that. There's no data that I know of that actually says that assertion is correct. So what we do know is that if you store it below the glass transition temperature, you should be able to store as long as you want. And yeah, it's a little bit more expensive, but you really don't want to have your brain unraveling over time and then discover when it's too late that what you need is no longer there. So yeah, I think that regardless of whether you perfuse fix or not, you still want to load the cryoprotectants in and then cool to cryogenic temperatures. But if you're going to have a lot of warm ischemic injury followed by a long period of cold ischemic injury, you may want to actually consider fixation if it's feasible, which it may or may not be. I don't know. But that's the one circumstance in which I was impressed by the potential need for it.
I think you've partly answered what I was going to ask you next, but what is your opinion on storing aldehyde-stabilized cryoprotected brains at higher sub-zero temperatures? I think what they use at Sparks, presumably -20 or something is probably standard. So do you think is that something we need a lot more evidence on, that they're going to be stable over the long term?
Yeah, I think we do need more evidence on that. I just think the evidence is missing. Yeah. And you also have to factor in the fact that even if theoretically that would be good in a very well and thoroughly fixed brain, it may just be that in most cases the brain is not going to be thoroughly fixed. And so it's good enough for the short term, but if you let it sit around for months or years or centuries, that the part that wasn't very well fixed is just not going to do very well. So, it's hard to say.
Okay.
I would like to see more data.
Yeah. Well, here's a question. This comes from Andy McKenzie, so I'll read his question. Your
Okay.
group won the Brain Preservation Foundation prizes in 2016 and 18 using aldehyde-stabilized cryopreservation. An open question since then has been whether a similar level of ultrastructural preservation quality across a whole mammalian brain can be achieved for cryopreservation approaches that do not use aldehydes. Do you think that the approach you recently published is likely to be able to achieve that level of verified preservation quality? And if so, do you plan to submit samples to the Brain Preservation Foundation for evaluation soon?
Yeah, so there's several facets to that. Let me just take the last part first. So we have been able to load and unload the brain completely. Ralph Spindler in my lab has been able to perfuse rabbit kidneys with rabbit brains with M22, vitrify them, warm them up, and wash them completely free of M22 and have good ultrastructural integrity. So he's just about ready to send Ken Hayworth some samples to look at connectivity. But the implicit question that came before that is, can we match immediate perfusion fixation, ultrastructural appearance? I don't think so, but I don't think it's necessary to do that. I don't care. It's not a goal that needs to be achieved. The goal is to preserve the structure well enough for the function to come back. If something is a little swollen or a little distorted or whatever, but it still works, I don't care. I only care about whether it works or not. So it's setting up a false contest between the ultrastructural requirements of fixation, which of course would be the gold standard. You can't do any better than that, and some other thing which will preserve the structure with viability, which ultrastructure cannot, which a fixation method cannot do, and still preserve the structure well enough. So I would answer the question by saying I kind of reject the question in the sense that it's not the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, can the two methods both preserve the structure adequately well, sufficiently well, for example, well enough to preserve the connectome? And I would say very confidently that the answer to that is yes.
Mm.
But we still have to demonstrate it. And hopefully we'll be able to make that kind of demonstration pretty soon.
Mm. It seems to me quite often on the brain preservation, the chemical brain preservation side, there's a comparison of tissue slices done in a laboratory where there's no agonal stages, there's no delay, and those are presented sort of comparing to much more difficult situations in human cryopreservation, and that's not really a fair
Absolutely
comparison
true.
either. You should at least take a death with dignity case where there's zero delay and so on. It doesn't have Alzheimer's disease or something like that if you're going to make a comparison. So
Yeah.
they put us at an
As a
inherent
matter
disadvantage.
As a matter of fact, to kind of amplifying that point, Nectome just published a paper in bioRxiv, which got massive media attention. And, the New York Times is saying we're on the brink of, human brain cryopreservation. And what they showed is that they could get decent fixation in 1 out of 4 pig brains
Mm.
because the difficulties of getting the fixation done uh, were sufficiently, present that they only succeeded 1 time out of 4.
Mm.
And so that kind of speaks to the difference as well.
Mm.
According to what they published, you only have 15 minutes between cardiac arrest and brain fixation before they don't achieve the kind of results that they hold up as being the gold standard. And conventional cryopreservation has no such 15-minute limit. We got good results, in my opinion, with Steve Cole's brain after 2 days of agonal hypotension, followed by 3 hours of cold storage,
Yeah.
followed by 2.5, 3 hours of cryoprotectant
Yeah.
perfusion without fixation. So I would say that that result from the prefixation camp kind of argues against the practicality of what they're proposing. But we'll see. I
Yeah.
mean,
Well,
they'll get better, and
in
yeah.
addition, as I understand it, Nectome will only, take a case if the person can go to them basically. And,
Mm.
I mentioned that to Jordan Sparks when I was in Portland, and he noted that they had a room there. He showed me the room where there's a bed. You can come because it's legal in that state. You can come. You can end your life
Mm.
legally in the facility. And he said he's had that room for 10 years. Not one person has taken him up on that. So I don't know how Nectome is really going to expect to have many human
There
subjects.
you go. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
just not a very appealing, prospect.
No.
Who wants to do that? Not very many people want us to do it that way because not very many people see it the way they do.
Yeah.
But suspended animation, on the other hand, has this rich tradition in fiction. And we have natural examples of rotifers that are frozen in the permafrost coming back to life after 20,000 years and things like that, right? So, it's much more believable, it's much more friendly, it's much more normal and human to just be cryopreserved the way you are rather than to be,
Right.
pickled first. So,
And there's
um,
also another layer to that because most of the people favoring chemical preservation seem to be not really interested in biological revival. They want to be scanned and uploaded. But of course, that introduces additional philosophical questions and technological issues. So,
it
uh,
does. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, certainly for me it does. I would think that would be a terrible strategy myself.
I don't actually have any problem with it in principle. It just depends on how I'm offloaded because I think there's a difference between a simulation and an emulation. So you can simulate me, and I might be just like a chatbot that sounds like Max More, but actually there's nobody there. Just like I think the current LLMs don't have any internal awareness or consciousness whatsoever. So that kind of simulation of me would not be survival. But I don't see any particular
Yeah.
reason why another substrate couldn't support my consciousness. But we know so little about that yet. It's very speculative
Yes,
what will be required and on what level you need to emulate.
absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a far deeper conversation and one in a different direction than we can really tackle today, I
Yeah.
think. Yes.
Let's see. I think that's the main questions. I have a few more if you have a little more time.
Yeah, I'll keep this going a little bit longer.
Okay. Do you think there are advances in transplantable organ cryopreservation have made the brain more credible as cryopreservation target in the mainstream cryobiology community?
Yes, I think everything makes everything else more credible. So an advance in any area makes advances in other areas more plausible. So one advantage of banking kidneys, for example, is that it makes brain cryopreservation more believable because at least you have an example of some organ that can be cryopreserved and still survive afterwards. And we know that kidneys survive for real because we put them into recipients and we let them survive permanently, and they have to support the life of the recipient so that they're not only alive, but they're functional. So if one organ can be preserved, then presumably another organ can be preserved, even if that other organ is rather different, and even if that other organ happens to be a brain. So yes, I think all of this work that's been done on rabbit kidneys and rat kidneys and now mouse brains, all of this is building a story that you can do this sort of thing is a more general proposition. And I think the rising cryo tide sort of lifts all boats, you might say.
In my book on biostasis, which I'm currently looks like I'm going to need an agent for, hopefully, I have a very large chapter on the science. It's a 40-page chapter, but it's really for what you're talking about, that the whole line of evidence, starting with simple tissues and you know C. elegans and things like all the way up to human brain tissue and other animal tissue, brain tissue. The accumulation of all that evidence really, if you actually look through that, makes it pretty hard to say, well, you're turning the hamburger back into cow or whatever kind of stupid thing that people say.
Yeah,
There is tremendous
exactly.
evidence, a tremendous range of tissues and organs, and it's just increasing. And your latest paper really, I think, adds, and I think also Alexander German's paper from I think last year
Yeah,
really adds a lot to
yeah.
this.
Yes, I agree with that. The evidence has been mounting, 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 and this has taken it to the next level. Both of those two demonstrations have taken it to the next level in different ways, which are complementary to each other. So it's nice that you can get hippocampal function back in one out of three mouse brains that you can cool and warm very quickly. And it's nice that you can get ultrastructure in a human brain, but the mouse suggests that you can do more in a human, and the human suggests you can do more with the mouse model. So I think it's all to the good.
I have one more question. I think this one came from Ashwin. Do you think there are still some low-hanging fruit in hypothermic organ preservation? What is your perspective on research that shows benefits for using a small amount of CPA and going below 0 degrees Celsius?
A lot of things like that have been tried for decades and never really got very far, but there are new possibilities along those lines. So there's been a real breakthrough brought into the field by Xiaoxi Wei, who's also very sympathetic to the topics that we're talking about in this conversation today. And she had the idea of basically doing what I thought of doing back in 1995, which is to make an artificial antifreeze protein-like molecule that's not a protein, but a molecule that has the same properties as the same effect to specifically prevent ice from growing or even nucleating. Uh, but she was able to dump tremendous resources and time and effort into it, and she came up with a really, really great molecule. And unlike antifreeze proteins, it's you don't have to get it out of a polar fish, and so theoretically you can make this much more affordably. So what she's been able to do is to really target that molecule to its exact natural application, which is enhancement of supercooling. Uh, uh, People have tried to do. I actually supercooled. I supercooled what rat hearts or something like that to -10 overnight 15 years ago, but they didn't do any better than hearts that were preserved without that technique. But she, for whatever reason, is able to get much better preservation of kidneys by supercooling them in a stable way. And her molecule kind of magically makes the supercooled state so stable that she was able to work with a human transplant surgeon who was able to perfuse human kidneys with this molecule, cool them to a few degrees below zero, put them in a plane, fly them from the United States to Europe, and transplant them, I think, and show that they work. And they didn't freeze along the way. The normal concern would be all that jostling and bumping around from point A to point B would nucleate the solution and freeze it, and that would be the end of that kidney. Didn't happen. So these things are becoming more and more possible. So if you can do that, then why not go a little bit farther? You put in like 3% crop protective agent that depresses the freezing point even more. Maybe you can extend the preservation time even more. But I will tell you that even the way things are now, people are beginning to get out to times that previously were way beyond the realm of possibility. So maximum preservation time using the most sophisticated methods in the past might be like 3 days, really pushing the limit. Now people are able to go out to a week, maybe 2 weeks, 10 days, that kind of stuff already. And so this takes us into a consideration of what are the benefits of short-term versus long-term preservation. And maybe for the benefits of short-term preservation, you've already done everything you need to do. Do you really need to go 11 days instead of 10 days? Is 10 days good enough for what you can do in the short run? For long term, you may, like for cryogenic banking, you can do more stuff. Like you can induce tolerance to the recipient's of the recipient's immune system to an organ that you got in the cooler, but you can't do that in 10 days. Maybe you need 6 months for that. Okay, so but maybe for the short term, you've done everything that you can do because you can't extend the short term preservation to 6 months. So the answer to the question is maybe there can be some additional things added on, but there's actually a lot of research, particularly in the recent years, that's really pushed that whole hypothermic preservation area forward tremendously, beyond what I would have predicted, actually. And there are other approaches like partial freezing and things like that that people are playing around with. So there's already a lot of activity in that area. So in terms of low-hanging fruit, maybe not. But in terms of maybe some simple additions to what's been done, like freezing point depression with a little bit of CPA, as the questioner was asking, maybe. But then who's going to do that? And, so we're interested in hypothermia at 21st century medicine, but we have a very good kidney preservation solution. You can flush the kidney with it and store it for a couple days and then transplant it, and it does pretty well. And you can flush a dog kidney with it and pack it in ice.
MHP2 or something related to MHP2?
It's a Renasol family solution. We haven't actually tried this with MHP2. I think this is probably better than MHP2 for that. But we did an experiment with a version of it called Transcend, trans, and then SEND for sending the organ from place to place. We took it to the University of Wisconsin, home, of course, of the University of Wisconsin solution. That's the dominant organ preservation solution. And we had our collaborator there flush some dog kidneys with our solution, pack it in ice for 4 days, and then transplant it. And the results were better than what you got with the University of Wisconsin solution. But we didn't have the capital to do anything about it, to take it into clinical markets. So we gave up on that. But what we have not given up on is brain hypothermia, because we were just talking about the difficulties that you run into with preserving ultrastructure after long periods of hypothermia after prior warm ischemia. So we can preserve pig brain viability for 6 hours under hypothermic conditions. We can preserve rabbit brain viability for at least 24 to 36 hours under hypothermic conditions. So there's a lot of technology that's already been developed there that nobody's using. And this, might be a conversation worth happening with some of the cryonics organizations, but the preservation techniques require continuous perfusion. You can't just flush the brain and with something and then store it for 24 hours. It's not going to work. But if you can perfuse it either continuously or intermittently, then you can extend brain viability for quite long periods of time, which may be better than field cryoprotection for a variety of reasons. So that's a debate that we don't have time for here, but it's a debate that I think eventually should be had.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot happening, and it's kind of exciting because I've been involved in cryonics for over 40 years, you even longer, and there's your vitrification breakthroughs, but then it seemed for a while that nothing too major was really happening. You might remember back in the late 90s, it felt like the singularity was coming, right? There was a lot of stuff happening. The economy was booming, the stock market was up, a lot of interesting technology decoding the human genome, and then it kind of got depressing after that. We weren't going up, but now we're sending rockets back to the moon. We're launching, Starlink's got 10,000 satellites up there. We're catching rockets in these hands, which is insane.
Incredible. Yeah, fantastic.
And all the things you've been talking about, all the new lines of inquiry, the new experiments, the new evidence. So it's a pretty exciting time. I think it's encouraging. Good thing, because we're not getting any younger. We need this to work for us, because I would prefer not to die in the first place. I know, and you work in that area too, but I think most likely we're going to need to be cryopreserved. So we want it to work well.
We certainly want it to work well for all kinds of different reasons. Yeah. So yes, pedal to the metal at all times. Yeah. Right.
Well, that's all my
questions.
Right.
It's exciting. A lot of things are happening. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
That's all my questions. Is there anything you wanted to add about the paper or future studies?
Well, let me. I wasn't prepared to answer that question, but let's see. I would just say that I want to salute Alcor, because if Alcor had not been willing to put its reputation on the line and take a huge risk by allowing this experiment to happen and allowing us to look under the hood and see what's under there, we never would have known, right? Yeah. And cryonics would have continued to be looked at as a fraudulent activity because there's no evidence to support it. Well, now we have super evidence to support it, but it could have gone the other way. It could have been an embarrassment. It could have set the organization back, but we had to know. And Alcor had the integrity to realize that we had to know, because if you're really taking this seriously, if you want your life to be preserved, you jolly well better know what's happening to people who undergo this procedure, good or bad. Yeah. And
hope
so
hope is not a strategy.
Right, exactly. Hope is not a strategy. Yeah. I agree.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, hope out the search for knowledge could be actually a detrimental thing, because it prevents you from discovering what you need to know for this to actually work the way it should. Fortunately, it worked out great. So my hat is off to Alcor and all the people there, everybody who helped arrange for the data and the actual experiment that made the paper possible, all the people at 21st Century Medicine, and people like you, Max, who are spreading the word so that it gets out there to benefit people's thinking. So it is an exciting time, and I think the moral of the story is, go forward and take that step into the unknown, because, it may be risky, it may be uncertain in how it turns out, but you'll never know if you don't go there. So we need to go there. Let's do it.
Be the adventurer, be the experimental subject. Yeah.
That's right.
That's why I kind of
Exactly.
like the word cryonaut, because it's, like an astronaut, you're voyaging somewhere. In this case, it's into the future, and it's a journey, it's an adventure, it's unknown. So it does take a certain amount of courage, which I think is one of the reasons it's not more popular.
I I agree with that. You're sailing into the unknown.
Yeah.
But if Columbus didn't sail into the unknown, we wouldn't be sitting here. So, you got to take a chance every once in a while. If the only way that the turtle makes progress is by sticking its neck out. So,
Right.
right.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. It's fantastic, very informative, and hopefully we'll have you back at some point, and probably also get Ralph Spindler to come on to talk about some of the work
Yeah.
he's been doing too.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Max.